we go back all the way to '94. And actually, Minnesota has actually one of the best crash database systems in the country. There's this thing called the Highway Safety, or what is it? Highway System Information, HSIS. I can't remember exactly what the acronym is. But there's 5 states, and all those 5 states have really good data, and Minnesota is one of those states. So we do have really good data here, probably one of the best in the country. So when the police officer comes out and he starts to fill out this report, these are kind of the things he's looking for. He's looking at the location. Here at MnDOT, we think the location is probably one of the most valuable pieces of information because we're trying to do infrastructure-based type things. So we really want to know where that crash is and make sure it's accurately coded to the system correctly. The police officer is going to report the date, the time. The time can be kind of jumpy. They usually kind of round to 15 minutes, but they try to be as accurate as they can. They get personal information. They'll take your name, your address, your date of birth, your age, your insurance information, if hopefully you have it. They go through all sorts of things. They'll record the weather, the lighting conditions, contributing factors, in the opinion of the police officer at least. The vehicle you're driving, the traffic control device that you're at, so is it a signal, is it stop controlled? They try to get as much information as they can, and all that information is taken and sent to DPS when it's done. There's also a little spot on the bottom of the box for a narrative. The police officer can just write out real quickly what happened or what he thought happened. And one of the most important things that's also recorded is the injury severity. And that injury severity it's a kind of a 5-point scale that's used. The most severe, of course, is killed. When somebody is fatally killed in a crash or within 30 days of that crash, they get coded as a fatality. The next one is an A injury, and this is kind of the acronyms they use for the police officers to know what they're thinking about when they're coding those injuries. And A is kind of considered an awful, just a crash, just somebody who's really beat up, really mangled after a crash. Typically, they say if you got to be taken away in some kind of ambulance, that's typically an A injury. We try to say it's going to be an injury that's going to be a lifelong, something that's ultimately changed the course of your life. A B injury, also called a non-incapacitating injury. B, we say it's bloody, broken bones, bloody. That'll kind of be that B trigger. The C injury is just a complaint. Somebody's, my neck hurts or my arm hurts or something doesn't feel quite right. That'll typically get coded as a C. And then if nobody's injured at all, that's considered a property damage only crash. So just your back bumper's beat up, and that's all it'll get coded as a property damage only. So here's the actual crash run that the police officer fills out. It has actually over 100 fields the officer can actually input data into. And we try to tell the police and we try to tell other people when they're filling this out, these are not just for insurance. A lot of these go into a lot of research. MnDOT looks at them, the counties look at them, the cities look at them. DPS does a lot of data research with these. There's a lot of national organizations who take the data off these sheets and do research. So these are kind of a data mine for a lot of different organizations to do research out there. So we always try to tell police officers, try to be as accurate as you can while you're filling them out, because these do have potential for other things other than just insurance. So what do we know about crashes in Minnesota here? So every year we know there's probably greater than 69,000 reported crashes. Now it might be more than that because some people just don't report crashes. Sometimes people just take the other person's insurance information and goes home. But the number of crashes that are reported to DPS every year, Department of Public Safety, is more than 69,000. And that's just within the last 5 years. We've averaged more than 69,000 crashes a year. Every year there's over 350 fatal crashes. And that totals out to be somewhere between 368 and 421 fatalities over the last 5 years. So it is a major problem. I mean, a lot of people don't realize how many people are killed every year in automobile-related crashes. 21,000 people are injured every year in automobile crashes. And those A injuries, those most serious type of injuries without being a fatality, from what we can tell from the data, there's about more than 1,200 people are seriously injured every year in crashes. So it is a major public health epidemic that a lot of people have noticed, but a lot of people don't think about it either. It's kind of swept aside. So through the majority of this presentation, like I said earlier, I'm going to mostly be focusing on fatal crashes. And you can kind of see the trend line here over the last few years from about 2003 on. There's been a significant drop in the number of fatal crashes, both in Minnesota and nationally. If we look at these crashes and we break them down, this information on the right-hand side there is from our most recent strategic highway safety plan, and it kind of breaks down crashes based on what are the characteristics of each of those crashes, especially K's and A's. So lane departure is probably the most significant crash. People driving off the side of the road and hitting something or doing some kind of damage to their vehicle and ultimately to themselves. Intersections make up a huge majority of those crashes. Unbelted is still a huge issue. People are not buckling up. We currently have 94% of people are wearing their seatbelts when they drive. So that 6% of the people who are not make up a huge proportion of the fatalities and severe injuries. Impaired driving, it's gone down significantly, but it's still an issue. And you can kind of just keep going down. Each one of those, it gets a little bit less, but all of those are major contributing factors to fatal and severe injury crashes. So why fatal crashes? Fatal crashes are different than your most common crash. The most common crash we typically see out on the system, it's probably a rear end property damage only crash at a signalized intersection. Lots of reasons for that, but typically happens on a clear sunny day, middle of the day, congestion related, but that's the most common type of crash we have on our network. But the typical fatal crash, it's a runoff road crash, it's in a rural environment. The person's typically unbelted, they're intoxicated, and it's, like I said, it's at night. So not that there's ever really a typical fatal crash, but if there was a typical, that's probably it. Another thing to look at too is that if we look at how the cars are hitting each other or how the car has impacted, there's a significant difference between all crashes and fatal crashes. All crashes, rear end and side swipe crashes are the predominant type of crash. And you know, the rear end is at an intersection. Side swipes are typically congestion related, and they make up 40% of all the crashes out there. If we look at fatal crashes, really rear end and side swipes are not an issue. Well, they're an issue, but they're not as big of an issue. The biggest ones, and as far as fatal crashes go, are run off the road left, run off the road right, head-ons, and right angle crashes. Those are really, they make up the bulk of the fatal crashes out on the network. So who's involved in these type of crashes? This is kind of everyone's probably seen this one before, but really something like 93% of all crashes have a driver behavior component to them. Is the person was either texting, inattention, distraction, sleeping, alcohol. All those things have kind of a human behavior side to them as to why the crash occurred. The vehicle and the roadway, we'll kind of get into those a little bit later, but they still contribute, but they're a lot smaller than that human behavior aspect. So who's involved? Just in 2013, of the fatalities out there, 260 were male and 127 were females. So it's over 2 to 1. You're twice as likely as a male to be killed than as a female. And that probably once again goes back to behavior. We men, we like to drive fast, we like to do stupid things, and it starts to show up in the crash data. So 35 pedestrians were killed. Every year for the last, probably as far back as you can go, about 10% of all our fatalities have usually been ped and bike. So it's a big contingent of the whole, but typically once again it gets left behind. People usually forget about it. This last year we had 61 motorcyclists or moped drivers that were killed in crashes, and 6 bicyclists. So, and on the bottom there, if you look at the injuries actually, it's about half and half. It's about 14,000 males, 16,000 females. So the number of people involved in crashes, you got a 50-50 chance as a male or female, but if you look at fatalities, it's 2 to 1 males. It's kind of almost an astonishing statistic. If we look at these by age, I was going to change the colors on this, but I forgot. Anyways, so once again, it kind of looks like it's actually young people, and probably a big part of that is, we're young, we're invincible, and the other thing is just inexperience. Is that 17, 18-year-old driver does not understand what they're doing out on the roadway quite yet, and then once again, it starts to show out in the statistics. So young, but it kind of, once you get older too, and the age thing, as you get older, one of the things that's probably a contributing factor is just that you're more frail, that if you get into a severe crash, you're not as likely to survive as that 25-year-old healthy person. So where do they happen? So if we kind of if we break it down by our system classification, there's probably 6 or 7 main types of highways we have out there. The interstate system, which everybody knows the interstate system, I-94, I-35, I-90. Over the last 5 years, there's been about 120 fatalities out on that system. That makes up only 7% of the fatal fatalities. U.S. routes, so your Highway 12s, Highway 52s, Highway 10s out there, they make up 283, about 16% of the total. Minnesota routes, your Highway 55s, Highway 23, those type of highways. Minnesota trunk highways, 407, 23%. That's a pretty good percentage of the whole. But the biggest one out there on its own is the county road system, the county state aid highways and the county roads. It's a huge network. It's about 45,000 miles. But they've had 707 of the fatalities in the last 5 years, about 40% of all of them. The next couple systems, the municipal, they make up about 9%. Municipal is a huge network, but it doesn't carry a ton of traffic on it. Same with the township. The township is actually probably the largest network in the state, probably 60,000 plus miles, but they only have about 5% of the fatalities. Only 89 fatalities in the last 5 years. Still a large number, but it's spread across a huge system. And then the other 14 fatalities, those are things like parking lot death. If somebody gets hit in a parking lot, or forest roads, or some other kind of private driveway, that's for the other 14. 1% of the crashes comes from. So, looking at MnDOT's 3 systems that we have active ownership and management of, the interstate system, the U.S. routes, and the Minnesota trunk highway network. The total number of miles, which is just less than 12,000, which it's actually only about 8% of the system. Minnesota has about 144,000 miles of roadway, but MnDOT actively manages 8% of that. But if we look at what the traffic percentage is, MnDOT system carries 58% of all the traffic out there. So it's a huge number, but we also have 46% of fatalities. So you can kind of look at that any way you want. You could say we only have 8% of the system, but we have 46% of the fatalities. That's really bad. But you could also look and say we've got 58% of the traffic, and we only have 46% of the fatalities. So a couple different ways you can slice the data however you want, but just something to be aware of. So where do they happen? 2/3 of all fatal crashes happen in rural areas. The county road system that I talked about, that's largely rural. A lot of MnDOT trunk highways are out in rural areas. So about 2/3 happen in rural areas, 1/3 happen in urban areas. And if you look at this population split in Minnesota, about half is rural, half is urban. So it's something to kind of interesting. 40% happen at intersections. Intersections are, only one vehicle can occupy a space at a time. Intersections seem to show that two vehicles in the same space at the same time is usually not a good thing. One of the things we did when we looked at the county road system, for the county road safety plans, we looked at all the rural intersections on the county road network. 13,000 intersections is what we reviewed. We could only find 14 intersections that had more than one fatal crash in 5 years. So if you're out on the rural system looking for where crashes pile up, it doesn't exist. It's so far and few between to have even more than one crash, let alone more than one fatal crash. So kind of gets to this idea that we're going to have to start thinking about bigger ideas for solutions to hit the whole network rather than black spots. Other things that are kind of interesting, horizontal curves make up about 25% of the fatal crashes as well. So, especially on two-way roadways. Two-way roadways probably carry a good chunk of the traffic, but they also make up 63% of the fatal crashes out there. And once again, the county road system, we looked at 19,000 curves, 19,000 rural curves. We could only find 5 curves that had more than one fatal crash. So all these fatal crashes out there on rural curves are spread across. They happen in one spot, and they never come back to that one spot, and it's spread out across just a huge network. So when do they happen? So there's kind of a perception, at least in Minnesota and probably a lot of winter states, that during those wintry cold months where there's lots of snow, that's when people are being killed. Actually, it's the opposite. During the summer months are actually the highest fatality months. The 3 summer months, June, July, August, are probably where most of our fatalities happen. So, and this probably has a lot to do with alcohol and people driving fast and enjoying those sunny days and making poor decisions on those days. If we look again, if we break down by the weekday, Friday and Saturday, weekend traffic. So probably people making poor decisions, again, alcohol, inattention, people driving areas where they don't necessarily know. But, yep, the weekend traffic is Fridays and Saturdays make up the bulk of the fatalities, or at least that heightened. By time of day, this is one's kind of, doesn't really tell you a ton, but it kind of tells you kind of that mid-afternoon to the commuter rush. and then that early morning, that's kind of where the bulk of the fatalities happen. Crash causation. So, what's my, yeah, okay. So when do they happen? Wait, what's that? Why do they happen? Sorry. So this is kind of, you saw this earlier as the driver behavior one, but this is kind of more specific to Minnesota. This was also taken out of our strategic highway safety plan. Minnesota drivers, 92% of all crashes are driver behavior related. 34% of it's the roadway, and the vehicle itself is only about 9%. So I'll get into kind of each of those, but there's kind of some overlap between each of those. You know, you can have a bad road or bad environment, and you could be sleeping at the wheel. Those two things kind of contribute to a crash at the same time. But bulk of it, once again, driver behavior. So why do they happen? Like I said before a couple of times, human behavior is a huge part. That's probably the largest contributing factor. Things like distraction, inattention, that's been getting a lot of attention lately, but it is a very big contributing factor. Is people playing with their phones, playing with the radio, daydreaming, falling asleep, all sorts of things that you can kind of lump into the distraction, inattention group. Alcohol is still a huge problem. Probably 1/4 to 1/3 of all fatalities out there are alcohol related. Now that's a huge improvement to what it was back in the 1960s and 70s. Over 1/2 of all fatalities were alcohol related. So it's come down quite a bit, but it's still a big problem. Seatbelts I mentioned earlier, still a big problem. Right now Minnesota has 94% of people wearing their seatbelts, which means 6% of people are not, but that 6% makes up probably close to half the number of fatalities out there. So if you're not wearing your seatbelt and you get into a bad crash, you're probably going to have a much worse day than if you had been wearing your seatbelt. Speeding, aggressive driving, something we've probably all done one time or another, but it can have bad outcomes, and it's still a leading factor of why crashes happen. And then once again, experience. Young drivers, sometimes they don't know what they're doing. They're new to this, and that can cause a lot of crashes too. You see that in the crash record. You see it in the crash set, in the crash data set. A lot of young drivers have problems driving. The roadway environment. So things that contribute to crashes, weather, we all know that, snowy, rainy, those can all lead to crashes. Another one is clear zones, and I'll explain that a little bit. Clear zone is just that area outside of the white pavement marking to the right. If you go off the roadway, if it's a nice soft shoulder that's a ditch with just grass, the outcome is typically a lot better than if you go off the roadway and you start hitting trees or utility poles, or there's no recovery, you go over that side and you start rolling. That'll make things much worse than if you have a soft shoulder to land on or to drive through. Intersections, once again, intersections keep kind of popping up. Intersections are usually where things happen. And then the lighting and the visibility. We know that more severe crashes happen at night than during the day, but there's a lot more crashes during the day, so you can kind of look at it either way. Vehicles. So things like tire blowouts. Every once in a while you read a crash report where a guy's tire blew out and then he crossed the center line, and then that usually has a bad consequence to it. So that kind of gets back to poor vehicle maintenance. Sometimes, a lot of times when they do more in-depth crash reports, they'll read about the vehicle and something on the vehicle wasn't up to snuff, and that can cause problems later too. I think the state of Virginia actually has an active program where you have to come in and get your vehicle checked every 6 months, and they had to clear it that it's okay for the road to use. And they found that actually had a pretty good impact on lowering the number of crashes out there. Heavy commercial vehicles. For some reason, people don't know how to react or act around heavy commercial vehicles. They only make up about 4% of the entire traffic mix out there, but they're involved in something like 12% of the crashes. So heavy commercial vehicles, they're not causing crashes, but people tend to get into crashes with heavy commercial vehicles for whatever reason. And then motorcyclists. Motorcyclists, the last few years, we've seen kind of this continuous uptick in the number of motorcyclist crashes. Some people hearken it back to the days that all these baby boomers are trying to relive their glory days. So they go out and they buy a brand new bike that they can't quite handle, and they get into a messy situation. Whether there's a lot of truth to that or not, I'm not sure, but that's what a lot of people are saying. So what is MnDOT doing? There's kind of two approaches that MnDOT's looking at. We've got I went through this really quickly. We've got reactive projects, and the idea behind reactive projects is it's kind of the way we've always done it. Not always, but for the most time, way back when people would take crashes, they would put them onto a map, and they try to locate them, and they try to see where are the most black dots on this map, and that's where the black spot comes from. So if there's a crash, you put a black spot here, and if you saw another crash, you put a black spot there on the map, and whichever spot had the most whatever area had the most black spots, that would be called a black spot, and that's where the most crashes were. So, and people try to fix that area through whatever kind of countermeasure they could come up with. Typically, these things tend to be more expensive. They're things like traffic signals, redoing intersections, eventually maybe even interchanges. But they typically also have a longer planning process. They have a longer design process. So usually when a black spot starts to come through, that's usually just the starting trigger. So you got to realize you got a problem, then you got to figure out how to fix the problem, and then you've got to design the problem, then you've got to construct the way to fix the problem. So it takes quite a while to get out there with a reactive project. Things that we've always done in the past, things like interchanges, like I said before, big, expensive, long planning process, takes a long time to get it out there. And then things like 4-lane expansions, those have always been a big one too to reduce crashes. Once again, long planning process, a lot of design, takes a long time to construct it, to find the funding for it, but that's always been kind of the way it's been done. So kind of a more recent approach, probably within the last 10, 15 years here, has been kind of more of a proactive approach, is let's get out there before the crash happens. The thing that's hard about that is it's hard to know where the next crash is going to be, but the whole idea is to look at these things systematically, or systemically, however you want to say it, is that we know as a whole, we know there's a lot of run off the road crashes. We know there's a lot of intersection crashes. We know that there's a lot of alcohol problems out there. So looking at the crash data set as a whole, we try to figure out a way to kind of proactively go after that. So things like, we know alcohol is a problem. The big thing to get after alcohol is enforcement, and to change the culture of the way people look at drunken driving. Systemically, we know that running off the road is a big problem, so we've started to implement things like rumble strips to try to get at that. So these proactive projects, since we got to kind of implement them everywhere, they got to be pretty low cost, and they have to have a pretty high benefit. But one of the benefits of that too, though, is we also have shorter implementation. You don't need a plan for 5 years to put out rumble strips. You can probably do it next summer if you want to. And that kind of gets back to this whole idea of deployed across a wide area. Try to get it statewide. Try to get these things in as many locations as you can, because they're cheap, and we don't know where the next fatal crash is going to be. So proactive projects, there's kind of a split here, but for proactive projects, there's kind of the rural side and there's urban side. So the rural side, we try to do things like rumble strips, both edge line and center line. The whole idea of the rumble strip is that as you cross that center line or you cross that edge line, you're going to get a little bit of a blip or a little bit of vibration in your wheel to tell you you're going where you ought not to go. They're highly effective. They work very well. There's a little bit of controversy behind them depending where you are, but that's for another day. Intersection lighting is another huge one. It's pretty low cost. It's been proven to reduce fatal crashes by 20 to 40%, especially in the rural areas. And it's just something to do with that little beacon of light out there in the distance that tells you where you are and where you want to turn. And it also helps you to alert other drivers in the area. So very effective. The next one, chevrons on curves. Chevrons are actually the only sign that's been proven to have a safety benefit to it. So it's very beneficial. It just tells the driver that, hey, coming up ahead here, there's a curve in the roadway, and every time you see a chevron, there's a curve in the road. So they are very effective. They don't lose their meaning, because every time someone sees a chevron, there's a curve in the road. And then kind of the next one is that hand signing. Let people know that there's a stop sign ahead. Let people know that there's something up ahead that's not usual. So it can be effective if done correctly. Just some pictures, kind of like I said, that little note of light in the distance can make a big difference to drivers, especially at night. And there's actually research saying that even daytime crashes get reduced with intersection lighting, even though it seems kind of counterintuitive. Even just that little note off in the distance can alert people to something, that there's an intersection up ahead, or there's something different up ahead that you should be paying attention to. Rumble strips, we know what rumble strips like, and then once again, chevrons. Just good pictures. So proactive projects on the urban side, things like road diets, and I'll talk a little bit more about those. Signal improvements, medians, pedestrian countdown timers, all very effective. So road diets, the idea of the road diet is this, is you basically have a 4-lane undivided roadway, typically urban. It's a road that's got a lot of access, a lot of things going on. A lot of people use this road not necessarily for commuting, but for getting to certain places along that roadway. The idea of the road diet is to turn that 4-lane into basically a 3-lane. So you have you basically have two one-way roads going each way, and then you have a center lane that's a 2-way left turn lane. And these have actually been proven to drastically reduce crashes. And the other benefit too is you kind of get a little bit more of a pavement space on both sides, so you can do things like either parking or bike lanes or something else to kind of get protect those most vulnerable users like your pedestrians and your bicyclists. Very effective and very cheap to do. Usually it's just a matter of reallocating your pavement and putting on new stripes. Countdown time, or other things that we're doing, especially at signalized intersections, things like pedestrian countdown timers. Most people are familiar with those. These have a pretty good safety benefit for pedestrians, but they actually have a benefit for drivers as well. How many people here have driven down the road and you see the countdown timer's got 20 seconds left on it, and you know you got plenty of time to get through that signal, or it gets down to 2 seconds and you know you better start paying attention. So not only effective for pedestrians, but it's also effective for all users. Even though that wasn't the intent, it turned out to be that way. The other thing that's really effective, or not necessarily effective, there's not a lot of research on these yet, but the idea of confirmation lights. One of the biggest problems with signalized intersections is people running red lights and causing crashes. There's a significant number of right angle crashes at signalized intersections, and the only way to get a right angle crash at a signalized intersection is somebody has to run a red light. And the reason why people are willing to run red lights is because there's very little enforcement out there. Has anybody here actually got a ticket for running a red light? I'll be honest, I have, but that was up in Fargo. So one of the problems with doing red light enforcement too is that for most police agencies is you need 2 police officers. You need a police officer on the upstream end and you need a police officer on the downstream end. And the reason for that is it's very unsafe for a police officer to go through a red light chasing another person. So agencies kind of across the country have decided that if we're going to do red light enforcement, we're going to have 2 police officers. Well, most agencies can't commit 2 police officers at a given time to one signal. Most police agencies probably just have 1 person, if at all, committed to doing traffic enforcement. So what the confirmation light does is this is on the back side of the signal, and the police officer can actually sit on that downstream end and actually see this blue light. And when the red light above goes on, this blue light also turns on. So it tells the police officer that the red light's on and I can watch this person go through the intersection. And now I know, and it stands up in court, that this person ran a red light, and I can ticket them for running a red light. And Minnesota's got a few spots for them. We were trying to get more of them out there, and we're trying to do it as we put them out there that we also get the police agency to say yes, we will enforce this. So, but they're very cheap. They're only like $1,000 an intersection. So, probably one of the lowest countermeasure costs we have. Other things that we're doing. This is kind of more of a local thing, but the idea of curb bump outs. It's just when you get to an intersection, you do this little curb bump out. And what that does is it allows the pedestrian, as they're walking, they can get out in front of traffic, traffic can see them, and at the same time, it also reduces that distance they've got to cross. So they've been proven to be very, very effective. They're very good at traffic calming, getting people to slow down in those areas. And kind of the other idea here, this pedestrian-friendly streets. So it's this idea of the curb bump out and a median. It allows the pedestrian they only have to cross a very short distance, so they're exposed for a minimal amount of time. It helps them break up that step so they can get to the median, stop, wait, and then go again. And then it also has this effect of what's called traffic calming. It gets the traffic to slow down. It gets them to realize that they're in a pedestrian environment and they better be paying attention. So it's very effective. They've done this in a couple areas across the state, and most of the people who live in the cities or live near these just love them. They think they're the best thing ever. So why proactive? I'm going to kind of walk through just a little bit of an example here to kind of highlight the problem about why we got to go proactive. So if we just look on our rural 2-lane highways, and if we just focus on U.S. highways, Minnesota highways, the county road network, in the last 5 years there's been 300 fatalities on those 4 systems, and that's just run off the road crashes. That's running off the road right or running off the road left. So 325 fatalities, that's a pretty big number. But these 325 fatalities, they don't really pile up at any one location. They're spread out across the whole network. That whole network that I just described is nearly 50,000 miles of roadway. Huge number. There's no black spots, like I said. It's highly random. Where you have one this year, you're probably not going to have one there for a long time, or you're going to have one just a mile down the road. There's really almost no rhyme and reason to why it's happening. But if you break that down, if you look at that by the number of crashes, by the number of miles, by the number of years, you get this number on the bottom. You get 0.0012 fatal crashes per year per mile, which means if I was looking at 1,000 miles of roadway, I would maybe see 1 fatality a year that's run off the road. So it's this idea that there's just so much out there that we can't actively go after everything all at the same time. We have to kind of spread it out. And this is one of the problems we kind of realized when we were out on the county road system talking to the county road engineers. A lot of them would say, you know, I don't really have a problem. I don't have an issue. Look at my system. The last 5 years, I've had one fatal crash. And looking at the data, they were right. They only had one fatal crash. So how do you tell a county engineer, or how do you tell somebody who's managing a huge amount of roads that you have a problem when you only have one in the last 5 years? So looking at this individual segment, looking at this individual road, you don't see a problem. You don't see an issue. But if you sit up where guys like Ken and me sit, and my boss Brad Estoshan, you look down at the whole state and you see 325, 700, 1,000 fatalities over 5 years, now you see a problem. But looking down, when you get down to the individual road, you get down to the individual county, the problem kind of starts to disappear. But it's still a problem. So here's kind of what the rumble strips do. Rumble strips are $3,000 a mile. Pavement markings are how much a mile, Ken?
Less than that.
Less than that, but that's my point. Is there's not a lot we can buy for $3,000 a mile. Yeah. So even pavement markings, even paint on the roadway is $1,200 a mile. $3,000 a mile is probably about as small of an investment as we can make. But they have a 20 to 40% reduction in fatal crashes. Huge number. Chevrons, $3,500 a curve. Anybody here ever do a project where you realigned a curve? That pretty much costs you $250,000, $500,000, $1 million per curve. Chevrons probably actually have a greater reduction in reducing fatal crashes than that, and it's only $3,500 a curve. 25 to 50% reduction in fatal crashes. Intersection lighting for about $10,000 to $15,000 an intersection, you get a 25 to 40% reduction in fatal crashes. So all those numbers, if you added them up and you applied them statewide, you'd get a pretty big reduction in crashes, and especially fatal crashes. So, with that, any questions?
Where's that photo from?
I got it off Google. It was a MnDOT. It's a MnDOT picture, but I think it's off Highway 7. Somebody asked where the picture was from, just so I repeat the question. Yes, Ken.
It's my understanding that Hennepin County has a high number of pedestrian crashes. Where do those occur?
Where do they occur? They probably happen at intersections in Minneapolis.
I guess talking with Howard Presser, who did the studies,
Yep.
indicated in the urban counties that the vast majority of pedestrian crashes occurred at signalized low-speed
Yep.
intersections.
Yeah, it's.
And so that is an area where attention needs to be drawn to.
Yep.
But what do you do? And your example earlier indicated about the only thing you can do. You know, you've got a high incidence of those types of crashes at that location, signalized low speed.
Yep.
The only thing you can really do is reduce the exposure of the pedestrians. So I thought that was pretty telling. And I think that some of the urban counties didn't want to hear that.
No.
Because they didn't know what to do with those locations.
Yeah, and there's kind of that perception that once you put a signal out there, it's safe and we can leave it alone. But if you really look at the data, we have a number of right-angle crashes that are severe, and you have a number of pedestrian crashes that are severe at signalized intersections. So signals are good in the right place at the right time, but they don't fix all the problems all the time either. It's interesting too, if you look at our metro safety plan, if you look at signalized intersections, once again, you even get the same problem where you don't have fatal crashes piling up. You maybe have 2 or 3 severe and fatal crashes at any given intersection in 5 years. Once again, they're spread across 600 intersections, thousands of intersections within the metro area, and even the concentrated number of crashes that there are in the metro, they still don't pile up in one location, especially on the fatal and severe severities. So, other questions?
Yes, we had a lot of success with Trunk Highway 8 in the last 15 years. I don't know if it's called a Super 2 now or what, if that was the objective. But is there been any analysis that takes that segment of Trunk Highway 8 and looks for other similar segments, or 2 or 3 statewide, be they state U.S. highways or county roads that have corresponding characteristics where we could apply that same formula and get the same results, or is there no place else like Trunk Highway 8 of 1998?
Repeat the question.
Yes. So the question was regarding US 8. I'm guessing you're talking about US 8 out in Chisago County?
Yeah, from Forest Lake to Taylor.
Yeah. So the question was regarding, do we have ways of, basically, are we comparing similar segments to similar segments and trying to get a kind of a comparison, correct? Is that a fair analysis? So what we do is, as a whole, we kind of look at crashes statewide, and we try to lump them based on the characteristics of the roadway. So we have 2-lane rural highways, 2-lane urban freeways, or urban freeways, rural freeways, expressways. We try to break it out so that we have things that are similar to each other. And then what we do is we get a rate for those type of things. So we'll get a crash rate, a fatality rate, a fatal and severe injury rate. And those rates are kind of a way to take the number of traffic and the type of roadway and try to make it so all things are equal, and then comparing that standard to that type of highway. So Highway 8, it's kind of funny that you asked about that. I was actually doing an interview yesterday on US 8 about US 8 and all the crashes out on US 8. So what we found on US 8 when we did it, we just did a road safety audit out there, is we found that even though the number of crashes is high, I think there's been over 500 crashes in 5 years out there, or 10 years. 500 crashes in 10 years. It sounds like a lot of crashes, but if you look at the type of crash, the crash rate that we'd expect for that type of roadway and the traffic volume out on that type of roadway, it has about the number of crashes that we would expect.
Which is lower than 15 years ago.
Yeah, and yeah, if you look at US 8 over the last, even the last 30 years, the number of crashes and the number of severe crashes has fallen pretty significantly. Well, the traffic volume has actually been growing. So it's been getting better. They've been doing a lot of work out there. It's a much safer road than it used to be, but there's always room for improvement as well.
Well, my question is, can you plug that into what we know about the whole 12,000-mile trunk highway system and 30,000 mile facade or something? And can the system tell you back, here's something that has similar characteristics?
Oh, so like kind of like what you said with the
a similar situation to what it was before MnDOT started driving down.
So kind of like you said, the 1998 US 8 was like this.
Right.
This road, US 10 now in this segment is kind of like 1998 US 8. We don't have a direct way of doing that, but we kind of have metrics and ways of kind of getting at things like that and kind of compare. We try to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples before we say there is a problem or there isn't a problem. So
We can talk about the highway safety manual.
Yeah. Can I get in a question?
Sure.
Rod.
Yes. Can you discuss the impact of guardrail on either increasing highway safety or reducing highway safety? I've heard comments that it increases the number of motorcycle fatalities to put guardrail in.
As far as guardrail goes, my best understanding and what we kind of see in the crash data is that when you put things like guardrail or even high tension cable barrier out there, you'll see an increase in the number of crashes, but you'll typically see a decrease in the severity of those crashes. So a good example, like high tension cable barrier, we'll put that out there and you'll probably see a big uptick in the number of property damage crashes just because people are hitting it and they can't really get away. So we know that they hit it. But at the same time, all the high tension cable barrier we put out there, we still have not had a fatality that's actually been able to cross that barrier and hit somebody else. So it's kind of, you got to kind of weigh your risks and your benefits. MnDOT has actively decided that a few more property damage crashes is worth it to save lives. As far as motorcyclists and barrier, we've heard that before, but we really haven't seen it in the crash data yet. I think as a motorcyclist, if you hit anything out in the roadway, it's probably not going to be a good day for you. Whether you hit barrier or you hit a tree or you fall into the ditch, probably none of those things are going to be great. We really have not seen anything in the data saying that hitting a certain type of barrier is going to be any worse for you than another type of barrier. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
A lot of those rural roads have no shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the stripe and that's it.
Yep.
So you put a rumble strip on that stripe and you've got a reaction of nothing.
Yep.
Does adding a shoulder of some distance help?
So the question was regarding shoulder width and that effect on safety. Is that a good summation? So what we found is that adding shoulder width does increase safety. The wider the shoulder, typically the the more safer the road is. One of the interesting things that we found though was that it doesn't make a difference if it's paved or if it's gravel. So a paved surface shoulder is really not that much safer than a gravel surface shoulder. So if you have 6 feet of gravel, if you have a 6 foot gravel shoulder, paving it isn't necessarily just going to make it safer. Having that 6 feet is what's important. So wider shoulders do make a safer roadway, but at the same time, why we like rumble strips more than paved shoulders is paved shoulders are shoulders in general are expensive. Going on and adding a 6 or 8 foot shoulder onto a roadway, I mean, you'll probably burn $500,000 a mile pretty quickly, and you'll probably get a bigger safety benefit than you with the rumble strip than you would with the widened shoulder, if that makes sense.
It does. I just know some of these roads, they have the rumble strip. And if it's a higher pedestrian area and the speeds are 55, it'd be nice if there was a shoulder.
Yeah, shoulders are nice. I won't deny that. But if you're in a pretty rural area, usually pedestrian considerations aren't your biggest worry at that point. But it's something I always think about. Yes.
Question with regard to work zones. I didn't see a lot of breakout or work zone crashes. Is that a problem with the total number of crashes, or is there a problem with fatalities in work zones? Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like there?
Yeah. So the question was regarding work zones and the crashes versus fatal crashes. And Ken can probably speak a little bit to this too. What I know about work zones and my understanding is we have a lot of work zone crashes, but the total number of fatalities in a given year is relatively small. It's typically 3 to 10 per year.
3 to 10 per year. Last year there were 8. The year
Yep.
before that there were 4.
Yep.
So overall, and we have throughout a year, and we did a typical year, and what we found is that if you take each day as a separate event in relation to a work zone actually occurring out there, so you may have a long project that lasts 2 months, but if you take each day as an event, we have about 40,000 incidences of work zones per year throughout the state of Minnesota. Actually, that's just on the Trunk Highway system. Let me take that back. So we've got a lot of work zones that are happening out there throughout the year, and crashes are an issue in work zone. Fatals a little bit less so.
Yeah. So they're always a concern, but for the total number of fatal crashes in work zones versus the whole, it's a 3 to 10 out of 400 a year. It's a pretty small number, but it's something significant, and we have Ken working on that pretty hard. So if that makes you feel better. Yep. Any other questions? Go ahead, Dan.
You know, on the bump outs you showed, that looked to be a low-speed roadway.
Yep.
Do they put those on high-speed roadways, or is that just strictly low-speed?
I would say this is primarily an urban low-speed condition. So the idea of the bump outs is really to help benefit bicyclists and pedestrians. Those probably your most vulnerable road user in that situation.
So that's a one-lane each direction coming into that.
I think so. That's what it looks like to me. So usually in these bump outs too, you try to get the lanes narrowed down to 10 or 11 feet each, and that really forces the driver to really pay attention, slow down, and be aware of what they're doing.
But
So,
you could use it in 4-lane undivided. You could also use it on 3-lane sections.
yep, 3 lanes would probably be very effective, I think.
Did you want to talk about the highway safety manual by chance? And
I can mention the Highway Safety Manual. So the Highway Safety Manual was a tool that was developed by AASHTO 4 or 5 years ago now. It took about a decade of research and processes and analysis to come up with this tool, but it's kind of a way to, kind of like what John was alluding to earlier, this idea of kind of comparing apples to apples. It's a way that you can put in your characteristics into this model, and it'll tell you with pretty good reliability what are the number of crashes that you could predict, you would expect to see on this type of roadway. And then, so you could do that kind of on your base condition. If you're kind of in a situation where you're looking at a bunch of different alternates, you can kind of compare each of those alternates 1 to 1 and see which one, as far as the safety benefit goes, provides us the fewest number of crashes. So it's a good tool to kind of, weigh everything equally. rather than what it was always before, kind of just a hunch. A lot of traffic engineers just saying, well, I think this feels safer, but this gives us a little bit more of an objective tool to use, yardstick.
Would you advocate for its use in scoping?
I would advocate for its use in scoping, but I don't know what scoping will say, so.
You have told me a couple of things in the past that kind of struck me.
Yes.
One of them being converting a 2-lane rural roadway into a 4-lane divided has a certain safety benefit, but there are things that you can do that would take less to build and would be much, much less expensive that would still have a safety benefit to it.
Yep. So there's always kind of this is kind of an ongoing state thing, is that sometimes when we get into a safety problem on a rural highway, the natural thing that a lot of people think to do is let's make it a 4-lane roadway, two one-ways, 4 lanes across for safety. Now, there is some safety benefit to that. It typically does lower the number of crashes, but at the same time, if you look at the number of fatalities out there afterwards, it typically stays about the same. It goes down a little bit, but not as much as you would think for that type of investment. There's other things that we've been trying to proactively do to try to get, rather than jump into that 4-lane, there's some other things we can do in the meantime. Things like wider, how do I want to say this? Wider medians. One thing District 7 did down in Mankato was they added basically a 16-foot buffer between the 2 travel lanes, and then they put these
Flexible delineators.
Flexible delineators. Thank you, Ken. These flexible delineators down the roadway, and they've had that out there for about 2 years now. And as far as my knowledge, they still have not had a cross median crash yet. And before they put this out there, though, they were averaging probably about a fatality a year in a cross median type crash. So it's had a pretty big reduction, and the cost of doing that was probably the cost of paint and putting out delineators. Maintenance doesn't like it because they get hit a lot and they got to go back and put them up. And then plowing, it's not exactly the most fun thing either, from what I understand. But for the cost of what they did versus the cost of a 4-lane, it's been pretty impressive. So there's a couple other things out there that we're trying to get more of, separating that median out, trying to get those 2 opposing traffic lanes as far apart as you can, would probably provide a great deal of benefit. Because typically at that point, going off the road to your right is not going to be your issue. Going off the road to the left into the other traffic is going to be a problem for you. So, any other questions, comments?
Well, why won't you just put that median barrier, the cable barrier, in that situation?
On the 2-lane?
Yeah.
It's an undivided road, so there's not a place for the median barrier. There is an option out there called the 2+1.
16-foot median.
The idea of
For a 4-lane.
the idea of the barrier is it's interesting. Doing it on just 2 lanes might be a little hard because if it does get hit, you're going to cause some traffic issues. But there is an option out there. There's this idea out there called the Swedish 2+1, and what that is you have 2 lanes running one way and 1 coming the other, and then you have a barrier down that, a cable median barrier down that, and then what you do is you switch that 2 and 1 every mile or every 2 miles or whatever you decide. What's that?
If you switched it every 2 miles, you know what people would do. They'd speed up in that 2 lanes, and everyone's racing 80 miles an hour, and then you get down to a single.
But it allows that passing opportunity, which is a lot of drivers get frustrated in those situations. So.
The safety is there. The studies have indicated that that is a safe design.
Yep. So, and mostly because of that cable barrier down the median, it gets rid of that cross median option.
But
But
going back to, so you're talking about expanding a road from 2 lanes to 4 lanes. And instead, they put in a 16-foot barrier down the center.
16-foot painted barrier. So they separated those 2 lanes by 16 feet. And then in the middle of that 16 feet, they put these orange delineators in the middle of it. So.
Seems like a lot of space.
Well, the whole idea was to give people that kind of that reaction distance, that if you do go off, you got some space before you're in the other lane, which was what the problem was up there.
Cable median barrier and less space.
Access.
Where did you say that was?
Down in Mankato, Highway 14. They are getting a 4-lane, but it's going to be another 3 to 5 years, I think, before it's built. So in the meantime, rather than doing nothing, that's what they decided to do to stop those cross-median crashes, or those cross-center lane crashes.
And the challenge with cable median barrier is that you would then have a physical barrier throughout the length of it, And so your driveways that have access, they'd only be able to go a certain direction. You have-
We don't care about that.
Cover the mic.
They still need to turn around, and so you have to do a lot of planning to figure out exactly where the openings are gonna be, so people can do U-turns and
Yep.
things like that. So that's one of the, if you're gonna go that route with the cable median barrier, the 2+1 design has good width, but it's not the same width as a divided 4-lane road.
Yep.
And so it's been done in some European countries. Ireland has done it, Sweden has done it,
Yep.
some other ones. I don't know of any ones in the United States yet, because no one wants to take a risk.
No. It's, yeah, and the one in Sweden, what's interesting is that all their roads out there have a, I believe it's a 40-foot pavement top, edge to edge. And so rather than having what they had before, which was two 12-foot lanes, and I think, what would that add up to, like 8-foot shoulders on each side? What they've done is they've got basically a 1-foot shoulder, two 11-foot lanes. I'm trying to make sure my math adds up here right. Two 11-foot lanes, and then that 4-foot separation where the barrier goes, another 11-foot lane, and then a 1-foot shoulder. So there's really no shoulder on either side, but I mean, they squeezed everything right down the center there, and it actually works really well, so. I think people go 55, 60, well, it's in kilometers per hour, but 55, 60 miles per hour. They're all rural highways, so. Any other questions? Anything online?
Nope, nothing online.
All right. Well, with that, thank you, everybody, and I hope you learned something.
Thank you, Eric. A little bit of, I don't want to say foreshadowing, but some things that are coming up next month in October. Again, Traffic Topics is on the third Tuesday of the month. What we're going to be talking about is speed limits, and there was a recent change in the law related to how you implement speed limits in work zones, and I'll be doing a presentation on that. And I hesitate mentioning the next one because then you're going to just say, well, I'd rather have that one first. We're going to have Frank Dama from the University of Minnesota talk about self-driving cars in November. So that one's going to be a very interesting one, and we're really pleased to have him come in and talk about that overall issue. I think there'll be a lot of interest in that. But work zone speed limits, there's a lot of interesting things about that too. I just wanted to just leave on one little note. You know, my daughter and I were in a play earlier this year, and she came up to me with one day, and I noticed, I told her that the eye makeup that you put on, the eyebrows were a little bit too high. She looked surprised. So, that was a poor one, but anyway, thanks everyone for being here.
Is there accident history?
Yeah.
So really, from your conversation.
Yes.
That's so interesting.